the fact that this COLA movement has started and that we're also going to negotiate our contract in 2 years. We want to learn from those who have been active in this type of movement, who can give us first-hand experience and also knowledge of how do we do this, how does the university work, where is the funding for universities come from, how does that change over time, how do labor unions work, how much do we know of UAW, what's been its history. So this week we have Ben, and I'll introduce his talk after. Next week we have Dwayne Wright, who has been a graduate student at UC Davis for 9 years now, and he was highly active in rank and file mobilization at UC Davis against both the university and UAW bureaucracy. And there was this big rank and file caucus in UAW called AUDU. And he was highly active in that. He's going to give a talk about his experience of a series of strikes that took place over the past 9 years, which relates very closely to what's happening here. Some of those were also Wildcat. After that, we have Rolf, who is now a professor at Chicago Studies.
Yeah, Rolf Romberg, professor of law.
He was a student here in the 90s, and he was active in our union rank and file. So if Dwayne is going to talk about the 2000s, Rolf will be talking about our union in the 90s, which is where the union started really. And again, the point here is to get a perspective of the union, not from union officials, but from the rank and file, who were not necessarily in agreement with everything that union officials were doing. After, we are planning to have a little broader presentations. So for example, Nelson Lichtenstein here at the history department, he has been a labor historian of the United States, so he can tell us quite a lot about the history of UAW from its beginning to the turn in the 70s, the new liberal turn, and to today, which would give us a very good context of understanding the recent corruption scandal in UAW. And we have Christopher something from the Newfield from the literature department, right? Mm-hmm. Who has talked about the corporatization of universities and has written extensively about that. Who will give us a talk hopefully next quarter. Yes. Okay. Now back to Ben's talk. So, for tens of millions of students and education workers in the United States, college means debt and precarity, despite the promise of economic stability and prosperity. For much of the general public, college seems an institution apart, in service to elites and big corporations. How did we get here? How have students and workers resisted? What can be done today? In this talk, Ben Manski describes the drivers and dynamics of the corporatization of higher education from the 1970s to today, as well as the strategies and tactics employed by students, campus workers, and community organizations to resist and overcome. Ben Manski has been involved in campus movements since the 1990s, from the Progressive Student Network, United Student Against Sweatshops, 180 Movement for Democracy and Education, Center for Campus Organizing, Democratizing Education Network, and American Federation of Teachers, to the more recent Wisconsin Uprising and the global climate strikes. Manski is currently a doctoral candidate in sociology at UC Santa Barbara.
We're obviously in a moment where our conversation today and the conversations that will be happening through the teaching process and that are happening on campus all the time really matter quite a bit. And so I'm certainly honored to be asked to sort of lead off the teaching process here. I want to start off by, at one point, sort of acknowledging that, yes, I have been in campus and student movements for a long time, as well as other movements in the labor movement, environmental movement, working to build the democracy movement in the U.S. But at the same time, I'll also acknowledge that I have a lot of knowledge that's missing from this presentation. I'm from Wisconsin. I've traveled all over the country, done organizing all over the country, but there's a particular history of struggle here in California and at Santa Barbara that's intense and that I know something about. but I'm very glad that, so don't expect me to talk all that much about the California experience, and I'm glad there will be other people who are doing that. The perspective I bring is more national and international in terms of the approach here. The title of the talk is The Struggle for the University, the 1970s to today. And there are three main elements to the talk that I'm going to be bringing forward. One is an analysis of the corporatization of higher education and of education in general. The second is a discussion of some of the campus movements and social movement organizations on college campuses in the States over the same period of time from the 1970s to today that have resisted the corporatization of higher education. And then finally, talking about where we have to go. You know, what are we going to do to overcome, to transform this system? That sound good? Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So I always like to start with 1979. 1979 was a high point for higher education in the United States. And by high point, I don't mean this. Santa Barbara, I was looking for pictures of Santa Barbara 1979. And I don't mean, and I'm old enough, I remember polyester and orange and purple playgrounds and things like that, you know. And at the time in the 70s, people thought things were pretty bad. But actually, looking back, 1979 was a hopeful moment compared to what came later. And that's particularly true in terms of the trajectory of higher education in the US. So in 1979, the lowest quintile of families in the United States in terms of income could expect to devote 1/8 of their family income to paying for tuition. Okay. Since then, that has increased to 60%, 3/5. Okay, and that's actually 2009, the latest figures I could find when I was preparing earlier today. So the major shift in terms of the burden for the poorest people in this country. Closely related is the fact that we've had a reversal in terms of the ratio of federal student loans and federal student grants, right? So used to be 1979 that for every dollar in loans that a student would take out, there'd be $2 in grants they didn't have to pay back. Now it's the inverse, okay? A couple other things here. Student loan debt. I had a hard time with this, okay? There's different estimates, $1.5 to $1.6 trillion in student loan debt cumulative outstanding right now in the United States of America. That's not including credit card debt and other debt, which many of us carry, and is substantial. As close to zero as you could possibly find, maybe $1 billion, right, in 1979. Yeah.
Do you know how that works out per person who was in school?
There are statistics. I mean, yes, I could, if I were to spend some time online, I could get that for you. But it's been an enormous increase. It's been an enormous increase. Yeah, I mean, what I had slides before. I spent about an hour looking for my old slides, and I couldn't find them. As you know, when you go through a whole bunch of computers. So I pulled together some statistics today. You know, but really, what I'm just trying to give you a sense of is the trajectory right there. Okay, so you know, student loan debt was not an issue. When some of us were kids and others would yet to be born here. In terms of our own roles here, the ratio of contingent faculty to tenure-track faculty in the United States in 1979, for every one person who was contingent labor in terms of teaching, there were 3 who were tenure or tenure-track. Today it's the opposite, and the trend is getting worse. Right? So what happened? How do we go from this golden era, 1979, an era in which you saw also the greatest improvements in the 1970s in terms of access to education for youth of color, for women. Basically, all the gaps in terms of access to education were closing very quickly in the 1970s. How do we get off of that train and onto a different one? Well, for some people in the 1970s, what I'm describing as a high point was not a high point, it was a low point. It was the decline of American civilization. It was a disaster, right? There were a whole series of emergency meetings in the 1970s. In 1975, the Business Roundtable, an organization of corporate executives from largest corporations in the United States, put out a report about the crisis in higher education in the United States, right? The National Association of Manufacturers, I'm using their old logo here because they have a much nicer postmodern logo that looks friendly, but I wanted to use their older one there. The US Chamber of Commerce, got together and they did the thing that they do all the time, which is they identified a problem and they came up with solutions and they brought it to those who are accountable to them, which is to say politicians down the street in Washington, D.C. And they got legislation introduced and passed, and we'll talk about some of that. And a lot of this sort of followed on a now infamous memo, the Powell Memorandum, the Powell Memo, which I'm sure some people in this room have already heard about or already know about, drafted by Lewis Powell, who later became a member of the U.S. Supreme Court, but essentially laying out an agenda for the corporatization of institutions in the United States. Right? So they basically set in motion a program. Right? And I'm going to describe how they were able to carry that program out over the next 20 to 30 years. And there's 4 elements of this that I'm going to talk about. There are other ways, and there are other categories I could throw up here on the screen, but these are the ones I want to focus on right now. One is the transformation of research and the central role of research and of R1 universities in their agenda for higher education. Right? The second is changes in the financing of higher ed. The third is changes in the labor force, that's us, right? And then fourth, not so much a change that they sought, but one that they continued and that was actually impacted by changes in the way in which we finance elections, changes in the governance of higher education. Okay, so those are the 4 elements I'm going to talk about here. And I'm going to move fairly quickly. I mean, I could spend a lot more time on each of these, but I'm going to move fairly quickly because I also want to talk about solutions, and I also want to have plenty of time for us to talk together. All right, so let's move to research, first of all. Here we have the Wisconsin Crop Innovation Center. And I'm going to bring in Wisconsin here, and Wisconsin will probably crop up a bunch of places as well. There, the word got in my head. When I was an undergraduate at Wisconsin, I was a rural sociology major. Okay? I had been active in the environmental movement, and I met faculty in rural sociology at Wisconsin, some of whom actually started environmental studies here. By the way, Bill Freudenberg was my advisor at Wisconsin when I was an undergraduate student there. Okay, and they were very involved in sort of public interest research and a lot of things that really mattered to working people in Wisconsin and around the world. So I became an undergrad in that department. And I found out that our college, the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, had contracted with the Monsanto Corporation. Okay. Monsanto, of course, is a corporation that has lots of different operations, but at that time they were pretty much focused on genetic engineering. And this became, in that contract and the controversy over it and the fight over it became something that became national news and became international news and became sort of to this day, it's sort of a case. It's like it's a case of university research and corporatization gone wrong. So I'm just going to talk about it a little bit. So Monsanto put in, I think, about $20 million, okay, to university, $10 million initially. And so this is where some of that money went, right? And what they wanted the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences to do for them was to develop a type of soybean that was especially resistant to higher applications of Roundup herbicide. The problem that Monsanto had was they had an herbicide, right, that they were marketing to farmers, and weeds were becoming more and more resistant to Roundup. I think we spray Roundup on our lawns, by the way, and it's highly toxic. So, I don't know, there's students on this campus working to change that, right? But weeds were becoming more and more resistant to Roundup. And so farmers had to apply more and more Roundup to their fields. How many people have heard about this before? Okay, wow, okay. So you know about this case. So basically, Monsanto's problem was, how can we get farmers to keep on buying our product? We need to develop a soybean that is especially resistant to the application of Roundup herbicide. Okay? We need to do that because the farmers are putting so much Roundup on the fields that their crops are dying. Right? So they basically leveraged the University of Wisconsin's resources to develop that soybean for Monsanto. Monsanto gets the intellectual property. They bring it to market. It doesn't belong to the people of Wisconsin. A major change for the University of Wisconsin. I could go on, don't let me go down any rabbit trails. So I'll talk about warfare and all kinds of things. Major change, right? And Monsanto gets their thing, and University of Wisconsin, it looks good on paper, right? Okay, we get some money, this is good, we have new facilities, this creates career paths for our graduate students, our professors, our faculty get more publications, blah, blah, blah. But of course, Monsanto is not paying the full cost of that research, right? What happens a number of years later is that basically over the course of the 1990s, you see the construction of a new genetics building on campus, right? You see the closing of the Land Tenure Center, essentially the downsizing of this center that is devoted to studying and helping farmers in South America primarily, and Central America, and to be better stewards of the land, right? And to be able to engage in permaculture practices and other things like that, right? And you also see a lot of protests, right? You see protests from students, you see protests from faculty, you see protests from Wisconsin farmers, who were a pretty well-organized bunch, family farmers in rural Wisconsin, still very small farms in that state at that time and even today. And this is sort of representative of what was happening, what was beginning to happen all across the country and has picked up speed, this trend towards corporate financing of public university research. Right? This would not have been possible in the 1970s. Okay, so it could only happen in the 80s, and it did happen in the early 90s, because in 1979, Jimmy Carter signed into law bipartisan legislation called the Bayh-Dole Act. So it's named for its co-authors, Evan Bayh and Bob Dole. Evan Bayh was a Democratic senator from Indiana, Bob Dole from Kansas, later a Republican presidential candidate. And I like to say, anytime you have bipartisan legislation, you should watch out. Classic example. Also, other legislation that was signed into law in 1979 opened the floodgates to the student loan crisis, right? The federal government came in and backed up private loans to students, right? So a couple things happened in 1979 to set this in motion. If you were to look at the nice graph I used to have on my old slides, you could see the asymptotic rise from 1980 into the 90s and through the 90s in corporate financing of public university research. Right? Used to be, you couldn't do that. You couldn't have the intellectual property from partially financed research go to the private corporation when public tax dollars were going to it. Okay? So this is bad. I'll just use a normative term, bad, for a whole variety of reasons. It's bad because the priorities of research are being set by the profit agenda rather than the public interest agenda. In Wisconsin, this is actually almost like the level of immorality to this that really got a lot of people very upset, because there's something called the Wisconsin idea, which says that the borders of the University of Wisconsin system are the borders of the state. There's a very strong public interest tradition for the University of Wisconsin system, so a lot of people were just outraged on the face of it, right? But it's also bad because it has all kinds of other effects in the university. One thing it does is it leads to what I call the internal marketization of the university. So deans, other administrators are looking at their budgets. Here's these divisions, these departments, these programs that are able to bring in money from ExxonMobil, from Monsanto, from Lockheed Martin, right? And these other programs, social work, Chicana studies, women's studies, education, sociology, history, that can't, right? And it ends up driving decisions. And there's lots of examples of that. I mentioned Land Tenure Center, but basically, starting in the 1990s, you start having schools of education shut down. The School of Education of John Dewey shut down in the 1990s. Okay, John Dewey's education school. Social work programs, etc., right? So you have a pressure internal to every campus and within every system to compete for these funds, which don't actually account for anything close to the majority of the actual costs, but they're enough to leverage decisions, right? This also happens within university systems. It also happens within the higher education market overall. So within University of California system, certainly Wisconsin system, Texas system, New York system, all the big systems in the United States. You have what in Wisconsin we call the satellite campuses. There's 26 universities, okay? Madison's the big one. Madison, it's a little bit different than here. Here we got like, 6 that are big, or whatever, and a few that are smaller, but they're more parity. Wisconsin, you got UW-Madison, UW-Milwaukee, and so on. But these other universities are very important. Oshkosh is important, La Crosse is important for their communities in terms of access to education. There's good work that goes on there. But suddenly Oshkosh is like, we're going to get in this game. We have to get in this game. UW-Superior, we have to get in this game, right? And it starts in terms of chasing after this outside money. Okay. So it impacts lots of things that go well beyond the research that's actually produced, right? It impacts where there's TA ships, where there's RA ships. It impacts what programs have funding so that students want to go there, right? It impacts, you can see it on any campus. What are the new buildings? What are the old buildings, right? On campus, who has the dough? And I would argue it also was a driver of tuition increases, right? Because 20% comes in from a private source, whereas the other 80% come in, right? I don't think it's the major driver, but it's one of the drivers in terms of tuition hikes over these years. Okay, that's a little bit about research. A lot of this analysis, for me, came to me from a number of Canadian intellectuals, David Noble and Leonard Manski, both of whom have passed on, but they were kind of major intellectual figures in terms of analyzing what was not yet even called the corporatization of higher ed, but like collectively we developed that analysis. We looked at the corporatization of healthcare and we said, okay, well, we're seeing the same kind of thing that's happening here with education. So if you want to read more, those are some of the people I would look to, and I can give you good sources there. Ready to move on to financing? Okay. All right, so obviously, originally I put tuition. I'm very focused on undergraduates, actually. You'll notice that. I'm more focused on undergrad still my mentality. But there's other aspects to financing. Here we have a picture of the headquarters of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I don't know if anybody has ever been in that building. Anybody been by that building? A few people. Okay. Anybody ever protested that building? About 8 years ago, an organization I work with coordinated a campaign called Shut the Chamber. We were trying to, we had direct action campaigns and marches and so on, trying to basically expose the role of the Chamber of Commerce and put them on the defensive, right? So I've been there, but I have not been in. It's right down the street from the White House. The White House is like a block and a half away, basically. I think we all know in this room, so I won't belabor the point, that there have been massive increases in tuition in public universities, private institutions, private colleges since the late 1980s, right? And it's actually not really an asymptotic increase. It's more of a steady, increase over this time. So people started to notice it in the 1990s, right, and fight back. But what is still missing from public policy debates that take place in the pages of newspapers and legislatures and so on is that what's been driving tuition hikes has not simply been a decline in state support, right? There has been. That's the we would say that's the proximate cause, right? That's the thing you can see. Oh, there's less money going into these public institutions than there used to be in terms of the overall cost of higher education. But what's behind the drop in public support is these guys lobbying day in and day out to cut funding for public education, right? It's not actually the case that the public is not willing to pay for public universities and colleges. Polling has never shown in my lifetime that taxpayers don't want to fund public schools or public universities, right? It's just not the case. There are no rallies out there saying, kick those kids out of the University of California, Santa Barbara, or tax the hell out of them with tuition hikes, right? It's actually unpopular to increase tuition, right? Tuition is experienced by lots of people as a form of taxation, right? The reason why anybody who's worked on biannual, on budget fights in any state directly knows that it's actually lobbyists from the state affiliates of the Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers that are in there day in and day out who are lobbying to cut funding to higher education, right? And that has been, the single biggest driver, right? So again, off the top of my head, in terms of my home system, the University of Wisconsin, when I started undergrad there, had 61% of its funding coming from public, purpose revenues, GPR money, basically tax dollars. When I finished my law degree there in 2005, it was down to 19%. Okay, it's hovering around 10 to 12% right now. Okay? And I could say, oh, it's just the lobbyists from the chamber or from Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce, which is the state affiliate, that's behind this. But also they've had partners. I mean, there are what I call enablers, right? In other words, corporate administrators. So they're in the University of Wisconsin system, here in the University of California system, administrators have to make decisions about which side they're on. I played that remix of the old labor song from the 1930s, from Kentucky, which side are you on? Rebel Diaz put that together, but it's the same thing. Administrators have had to make that decision too. And almost universally, they've decided they'll work with these guys, right? So Kathy Lyle was president of the UW system back when I was an undergrad. And she was very explicit. She was also president of the Association of University Administrators, so there's national associations of administrators. So it's not, when I talk about Wisconsin, it's not just like Wisconsin is, all that. It's also was a central system and institution in the direction of higher education in the United States. David Ward, who was our chancellor, ran the other national association, for university chancellors, basically, right? And they were very explicit. They said, look, we cannot count on the public to fund our programs. So we have to plan for decreases in public funding. We'll ask for more money, but we're not going to expect for it. We're not going to fight for it. As undergraduates and as and members of the TAA, the Graduate Employees Union, and the faculty union at Wisconsin, went to them and said, Kathy Lyle, you should follow the example of the rector of the UNAM in Mexico City, who in 1968 led a march of 1 million students, right, in Mexico City. You should do that. You should be brave, right? The only example that I'm actually aware of. That's not the choice that they've made. So there's always an inside-outside to this, right? There are other drivers, increases in health costs, other things, but the biggest thing has been declining state support. Okay, good. Okay. And I don't have to explain. I usually explain this when I haven't given this talk in a long time, but when there was a point where I was going on the road and I was giving talks on all kinds of things and talked to undergraduates, and because we were so far away from the way in which the university actually ran most of the time, I have to explain, like, hey, guess what? That means your tuition's going up, but I don't have to explain that to you, right? Okay, good. All right, next, labor. This one's even shorter. All right, this is more internal, not so external, but it basically comes down to the same thing. Less money coming in from the state, less reliable money, more internal marketization, competition between departments. There's been some resistance to that within, the campus cultures have resisted this to some extent, right? But it's still there, right? And that has really driven the shift towards adjunct labor. So basically what's happened is higher education has been exposed to the sort of raw forces of global capitalism, the neoliberal era, and that has driven the shift towards faculty who are easy to get rid of when you need to shed costs, right? Just comes down to that. I'm not going to say anything more about that unless we want to. Yeah, go ahead.
Is that happening in the sciences as well, or just the humanities?
It's a good question. I would assume it's happening to a lesser extent, but that's just a guess. Yeah. Certainly, in terms of social sciences, it's happening. Yeah. Come back to that. Okay. Finally, governance. I'll admit I doctored this. I was looking around for a board of regents that looked like this. So this is Texas. University of California they look more postmodern neoliberal, But look, who's on the boards of boards of regents, right? They're almost uniformly throughout every system in the country, corporate lawyers, corporate executives, right? There have always been corporate executives and corporate lawyers on boards, but it's changed significantly in the last 40 years. Okay? From what I've seen, and again, this is not my graduate research. I'm just telling you things I know, right? This is an activist analysis, right? It's not a rigorous analysis, but what I have seen tells me that the reason why, and I have seen studies that show that there are more CEOs, that are less representative, they're more elite in terms of boards of trustees and regents. But the reason why I think that's happened is that you've had changes in campaign finance law and changes in the way in which elections are run in the United States, right? And so, boards almost universally, with a few exceptions, Colorado, Michigan, a couple other states where the regents are actually elected and you have students who get elected, and sometimes you get some very interesting people on those boards. Most states, the governor appoints somebody to the board of regents and they go through a confirmation process. Guess who the governor appoints, right? They appoint campaign contributors, like appointing ambassadors. I guarantee you, if you did analysis of these guys, they were all donors to Abbott's campaigns in Texas. California, Newsom, right? Jerry Brown before that. So you'll get liberal donors, or centrist donors, or corporate executives, corporate lawyers. You'll get right-wing ones. In Wisconsin, in the 1990s, when we were campaigning on various issues, we realized that we were having a lot of trouble connecting with our board of regents, so we decided to research who they were. And we found, first of all, it was very obvious that 16 out of 17 were men. It was easy to tell, at least it seemed like it was, to us. There was only one person of color on the Board of Regents, But then we found, hey, guess what? 16 out of 17 are also corporate executives or corporate lawyers, right? The only one who was not was somebody who was there are a couple statutory seats. So the head of the public instruction, was actually the only public interest position. So we started looking into these people directly, and boy, there's some heavy money, hundreds of millions of dollars, right? Heads of major corporations. Some of them very tied up in very right-wing projects, like the National Association of Scholars, funders of organizations that were actually attacking the university were on the Board of Regents, right? We came up with some creative campaigns. We had a Buy a Regent campaign. So there was a guy who was a landlord and a developer, the biggest landlord and developer in the city of Madison, who donated $10,000, which is the maximum to the governor's campaign. His wife donated $10,000. His children both donated $10,000. His dog didn't donate $10,000. $40,000 from this family, Fred Mose. Actually kind of a nice guy, and actually he's probably not a Republican anymore. He was the 1990s Republican. But he had donated that money, and he gets appointed. And so we decided we would buy a regent seat. And so we announced that we were holding an election in the student union, and we did that. We actually had several hundred people show up, and we took nominations from the floor, and we had our own candidate just to make sure there was at least one candidate. Somebody we didn't even know got nominated by their friends. He beat our candidate. He was a theater major. He was pretty well spoken, and he turned out to be pretty good. And we marched down to the governor's office with a check for $10,000. No, actually, sorry, for $1,228. We have to remember the story here. We had gone around the state of Wisconsin to all the university campuses with a democracy grail, a giant grail, to collect money from students so we could buy a regent on behalf of the students. And we presented this check to the governor's office, right? And then at the following meeting of the Board of Regents, we went with Regent-elect John Efron to the Board of Regents meeting and sat him down there and confronted with him. They all left the room, okay? They arrested a bunch of us later. So this was basically this was an ongoing campaign. Another sort of little working group of our coalition put together Board of Regents trading cards. They were really well designed. A picture on the front, their corporate holdings, the most racist thing they'd ever said. Fred Mose, it was about Hmong people working in laundromats. I'm sure he'd said worse things, but that was on the record. Pretty bad. Anyway, so the corporatization of US elections, which were not all that democratic to start with, also took off following 1970s. Actually, 1978, Bank of Boston versus Bellotti, first decision that set us on the road towards Citizens United v. FEC, struck down federal campaign finance regulations that had been in place at that point on the sort of very limited ruling that suggested that money is speech, right? So all and short of it is, the corporatization of U.S. elections had an impact on public universities too, right? Okay. So you already had corporate boards of directors for universities, but they become even more corporate over this time. Right? Those are 4 elements of the corporatization of higher education. Right, let's talk about what people did about it. Right? And that analysis, my version of this analysis, sort of comes out of struggling against it and trying to figure out what the heck was going on at the time. So one of the things that's odd for me, and you asked me earlier, you've been at this for a long time, one thing that's odd for me is there are a lot of things that I was involved with at the beginning when things were foggy and you couldn't really see what was happening, but you could sort of trying to figure out the trajectory that now are commonplace. Lots of people talk about the corporatization of education now. Nobody had any analysis of any of this, and we were, at that time. We could just sort of see that some bad things were happening, trying to figure out why, right? The movements social movements are the creators of knowledge about the problems they face and about the solutions to them. That's my social movement studies contribution, right? Praxis tradition, social movement studies, and let's take a look at campus movements in the United States over this period. And here you're getting something new from me, okay? So for a long time, I have said that in terms of, this is true of movements in general in the US over this time, not just campus movements. I have said that there is a tendency over this period for activists in the US to be primarily involved in single issue politics in the 70s and 80s, okay? And then in the 80s and 90s to start to move towards what we then called multi-issue politics. And people were, if you look at the activist literature at the time, people were saying, we have to move from single issue to multi-issue. Nobody was talking about silos back then, but this is the way people talked about it, right? We can move to multi-issue. So basically what that meant was, instead of having this mobilization, that mobilization, and pretending we lived in a pluralist society in which the levers of government worked, we would form coalitions between people who had different sets of interests and concerns. And it would be like, you help me, I help you, it's solidaristic, etc. But it's not synthetic, right? We're not in a common cause, we're just in alliance, right? So that's multi-issue politics. 1999, the Seattle Uprising, is when it becomes systemic. Okay, I used to call it synthetic, but I like systemic better because it sounds better. And it actually works better. So I changed that today to systemic, where people are like, we're in a common cause. All these things, it's one struggle, one fight, right? People had that slogan, but it became very real, right? And there was like a lot of, people started we talk about bodies now, but bodies started moving between different struggles all the time, right? So that happened, okay? And that certainly happened in terms of campus movements, and I'll show you some illustrations of that. The other thing, and this is totally new for me, is that in terms of campus movements, we actually had a shift that in some respects was positive, in other respects kind of costly. We had a shift in terms of, so this is the type of politics, I should say politics. Here's the type of organizational form, right? From more institutional forms to more networked forms, and then more recently to distributed forms, okay? So what I mean by that is, the student movement in particular, not campus labor so much, but the student movement in particular had a lot of institutional power coming out of the 70s and into the 80s. I mean, it's almost, I think it'd be very difficult to imagine. So, student association here is important, right? But the student associations in the 70s and 80s had much larger budgets, okay? They had much more economic influence in the surrounding communities. Right? They, like, for example, at University of Wisconsin, we had a student-run pharmacy. We had, WSA, student pharmacy. It was not on campus, it was somewhere else, right? All kinds of things like that. Women's health clinic, all these things that were run by the student association itself, right? And there's just, a couple examples there. And the student movement was involved in, and nobody's done this analysis either, and if we weren't all so busy, I would say somebody should do this. The student movement, I think, was funding a substantial portion of the broader left, in the US. And it's very underappreciated just how much they were funding, right? And that was just sort of accepted. That's what students do. You know, students are more radical and they're going to fund all kinds of causes, right? Those institutions came under attack, concerted attack, right? I'll talk a little bit about this. So the shift from an institutional form was not entirely by choice, right? We sort of made the best of it and we said we're going to move to more networked forms. But in some ways that was because our institutions were getting smashed, right? You move to more networked forms, which means there's still a form to it, like we're a network, you know, and everybody talked about networks, and networks are the form of social movement organizations of the 90s, right? But they were decentralized, right? You'd have coordinating committees or steering committees. You wouldn't have, you know, such tightly controlled institutional forms for social movement organizations that were founded in this period, right? And they were very good at doing some things, and are very good at doing some things, and not others, right? I would argue that since in the last decade, we moved from a networked form to distributed forms being more common. I would almost call this episodic. And to me, this is actually kind of problematic, right? And maybe it's just that I'm getting old and I just don't quite get it, but like, distributed, so very quick upsurges of activity, very distributed forms of communication, but not so many sort of standing formal connections over the long haul, right, that are sort of present in social movements in the US today. So, you know, the meetings that have been going on through this process are unusual in terms of what I've seen at UCSB, right? Like, you know, student groups I know, you know, have meetings all the time on this campus, but it used to be that, and because I talked to undergraduates and graduate students about what they're doing, it used to be that if you were on this campus or at any other major university where there's a lot of activism, it would be like 9 hours of meetings every night. It was insane. It was not actually healthy, but people were meeting face to face all the time and there was a lot more organization, right? So this has been something of a shift, right? And I'm not going to get into a whole like why this might be and internet and all that stuff, but it's a shift. So that's another thing that I think has happened this time. Okay, let's get to some specifics here. Any questions about any of that before I show this? Okay. Okay, resistance and movement building. So first thing I want to do is I always want to say, like, history didn't start when I was born, 1974 or 1979, where I'm setting this up. There's a history before this. I mean, gosh, at one point I researched the history of the corporation, and part of that involved like studying the history of universities. And guess what? Did you know that what we call the universities were originally student unions? I mean, this is insane. 11th, 12th century, 13th century in Europe. The student unions were called universitas, okay? And they were organized to deal with these guys who had their collegium, right? The faculty had associations, right? Called collegium, that's where we get college. So the college of faculty. The students organized unions, okay? To deal with the problems they were going to study under these faculty, they go to Naples, or well, not Naples, but you know, like Milan, or they go to Barcelona, wherever, and they couldn't afford, I mean, if you read this up, they couldn't afford to live there. They were starving. I'm not kidding. And so they went on strike. I mean, I'm not making this up. They went on strike, but they had a problem. They had the perennial problem of student movements, which is the problem of transience. Like, how do we consolidate our gains? So they went to the Holy Roman Emperor, and they went to other monarchs and officials who had staying power. They said, please, we would like you to recognize our universitas. And they incorporated the universities. And over time, the universitas and the collegium sort of got together and became the same thing. I mean, they're not the same thing even today, but you know what I'm saying, okay? So there's a history to this. In the United States, there's been many sort of points along the way that have really been transformative in terms of higher education, but one of the ones that I think is most important is the return of the GIs. I mean, in some ways, return of the soldiers from the Civil War, but then return of the GIs in the 1940s. We've been all over the world, supposedly fighting fascism, integrated companies for the first time in the US military. They come back and got to do something with them so there's not instability, so the public universities expand radically, right? And a lot of those people end up getting involved in the student movement. They formed something called the National Student Association, returning GIs, late 1940s. Okay, National Student Association is part of something called the International Student Union. the International Student Union is communist dominated. So the National Student Association eventually is sort of forced to pull out. Okay? By the way, in the early 1960s, it turns out the National Student Association is funded by the CIA. So the CIA co-opts this thing. The people who are running it discover this and are kind of surprised. You know, so actually, the guy who was president of the National Student Association was a guy named Ed Garvey in 1963. He was also a vice president of SNCC. He was I think he was the only white guy on SNCC's coordinating whatever I haven't studied SNCC in depth, but he was an interesting guy. He was also a mentor for me. He's from Wisconsin. He discovers this, he exposes it, big scandal, okay? They reinvent it and call it the United States Student Association, okay, which I hope people know what that is, but it's still around. Okay, and they're like, we're going to reinvent this thing. Okay, so there's a history to this, okay? You have the Third World Liberation fights, right? The struggle in the late 1960s into the 1970s created institutions that many of us are involved with today. That struggle still goes on. You also had the development of the redeployment of a politics of what was called student syndicalism in the 1960s and early 1970s, and the fight for a popular university. Okay, so they did not get what they wanted. They wanted popular control of higher education, general assemblies, elections, right, within the university. They didn't get that. What they did get in many places were more limited gains called shared governance, you know, student participation in shared governance. So part of the reason why you had, when you look at the previous slide, you had sort of more institutional power going into the 1970s was because of the 1960s. Right? They had fought for total control, democratization of the university, open campuses, free higher ed. They didn't get all that. But they got some of it. Okay, and that had an impact. Okay, so there's some history before the 1970s, right? I just want to play that up. Okay, what happens after that? So I would argue that in terms of campus movements, largely undergraduate-led campus movements, right? You had an emphasis on solidarity campaigns. This is the way that students mostly saw their work, and this is the way people off campus saw what students were good for, right? So out of apartheid, famous movement, very important, farm workers movement, right? All kinds of things, environmental campaigns, all kinds of things that people were involved with. And basically the idea was that students are the foot soldiers, they're at the front lines, they're gonna be out there, and their job is to help others, okay? Important stuff. You also had declining institutional power, as I said earlier. I'll explain some more about how that happened in a bit. And this transition from single issue to multi-issue campaigns, right? And so some of the major organizations, there were many organizations, but in terms of national organizations that I think are emblematic of this, are the Progressive Student Network, which was the most radical of these, organized maybe 60 campuses in the US, but had a broader influence. Their slogan was, "We're way beyond PC." So that was, they're sort of like kind of edgier. You had the United States Student Association. The Student Environmental Action Coalition, which is the largest student movement organization in the history of the United States. 12,000 chapters at its height, okay? And then later, much later, in the late 1990s, United Students Against Sweatshops, Students for a Free Tibet, East Timor Action Network, these types of things, okay? So people were doing that stuff. But in the process of struggle, people, activists figure things out. Okay, that's what activists like to do, trying to figure out, well, what do we need to do to win, and what is winning, and what am I doing with my life, and so on, right? Where is this going to go? So, to some extent, what happened was that it wasn't just that students were bringing the fight elsewhere, but the fight was being brought to students and to people on campuses, right? So the universities came under attack, and some of that was sort of this emphasis on, the corporatization of university research and changing who pays for higher education and so on that we already talked about, but some of it was also cultural and ideological, right? And so, education came under attack, affirmative action, right? Student of color organizations came under attack, students of color more broadly. This was a concerted campaign, so 3 of these represent this more concerted campaign. We're sort of a coalition of organizations, like the Alliance Defense Fund, which was based in Arizona, the National Association of Scholars, that were funded by a foundation called the Bradley Foundation. Okay, the Bradley Foundation has its offices in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, all Wisconsin ties. Big foundation, it's one of the biggest right-wing foundations in the United States. They finance the publication of the bell curve. Okay, for those who are not familiar, anybody not familiar with the bell curve? Okay, so bell curve is pseudoscience purporting to show that there is a genetic basis for different outcomes for people of color versus white people. And actually not people of color, sorry. Asians are supposed to be at the top, whites in the middle, blacks are supposed to be at the bottom, okay? And so that's the bell curve. There is a natural bell curve, right, in the human population, and so there's only so much that can be done in terms of dealing with racial inequality in the United States, okay? So this was pseudoscience. Charles Murray, sort of the more infamous of the two co-authors that made a big deal in the 1990s. A lot of people were outraged. My dad and I have arguments about things. We just had an argument about 20 minutes ago about stop and frisk. But I am proud that he actually wrote sort of the most cited academic takedown of this. He's an economist, just basically saying this is bullshit. This is statistical mumbo jumbo. He's a statistician. Just cannot rely on this. So did that. But basically, the point being here, the Bradley Foundation promoted this for a reason. They were also promoting the corporatization of welfare, corporatization of prisons, and the corporatization of education. The Alliance Defense Fund brought litigation against universities across the country. This one, University of Wisconsin, Michigan, there are a number of others, claiming that on behalf of various Christian, quote unquote, students, who claimed that that being compelled to pay SEG fees, right, student fees, to the university was a violation of their First Amendment rights to freedom of association, freedom of speech. So, and actually, again, the university that became the one that was at the center of this was the University of Wisconsin system, and a decision in the U.S. Supreme Court in 1998, Board of Regents versus Southworth, or Southworth versus Board of Regents. It sort of ended up with a sort of split decision, right? But what they were attacking was, by name, the Black Student Union, the 10% Society, the Queer Student Alliance, the UW Greens, the Civil Rights Defense Coalition, Campus Women's Center. You can imagine sort of the parallels here, MECHA, et cetera, at University of Wisconsin, and saying that by being compelled to provide fee money that was then dispersed to these groups, their First Amendment rights were being violated. So the result was, you could see this as sort of a legitimate legal argument. You can have a dispute, right, in court, right? But the intent was to take away the ability of students to use their fees to fund organizing. Yeah. And it did have that effect, even though facially we won, right, before the Supreme Court. The effect was that the way in which student fees have been managed since the late 1990s all across the country is very different, right? So it just, take away student association, put in labor union, it's the same thing, right? It's the same attack that was going on against labor unions using dues money for political advocacy, for organizing purposes, et cetera, that they were waging against students, and they were largely successful, I would argue. Not entirely, but largely. There was also a major fight in the 1990s over a side agreement to the World Trade Organization called the Multilateral Agreement on Investments. How many people have heard of the MAI? Okay, that is because we won. Okay, that makes me happy. But basically, there was an effort to expand the World Trade Organization and the GATT process to treat services as funding of public services as potential barriers to trade. Right? So you have differential tuition for in-state versus out-state. That could be a barrier to trade, right? So education was in the crosshairs. There was a global fight back against that. It's part of the ramp up to what became the battle in Seattle, right? And we ended up winning on that front, right? But in the process, so people come under attack. There's attacks on affirmative action on students of color, campus labor unions, public education in general. And you're like, hey, who's attacking us? Why are they doing it? What are they trying to achieve, right? What's this all about? Okay. Still with me? Okay. So we lose institutional power, but we get knowledge, right? There are some new forms of action and organization that come out of these responses. I'll point to a couple. One of them are graduate employee organizations, or student unions, right? This is the oldest one in the country is my old union, the TAA, AFT 3220, started in 1970. This is from a strike in 1980. A lot of times when I see campus labor struggles described, it's like, oh, there's been this growth since the 2000s. No, this has been like a steady slog for a long time, for decades. There were even graduate employee unions in the 1930s, okay, and then they sort of collapsed. But really, it's been since 1970. So that's one thing, and the formation of the Coalition of Graduate Employee Unions, so some sort of a network, which no longer is functioning, unfortunately, so that's part of that shift towards more distributed forms of organizing. And that's one thing. Another thing I'd point to are citywide and statewide K-12 and higher education coalitions. So the two that really stand out for me from this period are the Student Liberation Action Movement, or SLAM, in New York City. Massive citywide uprising in, I think, 95, maybe 96 in New York City. And then in Philadelphia, a whole series of these coalitions where people are saying, they're connecting the dots and saying, hey, there's corporatization of K through 12 schools, charter schools and vouchers and corporate advertising in the schools. And there was a lot of fight back against that from unions and parents and students, right, and teachers. And this is the same kind of agenda that we're facing in the university. So there's close linkages there. And oftentimes the ed school people, honestly, I know there are a couple here, were the people who were making some of those linkages, because guess what? They're the future teachers, or they're teaching the teachers, right? Those are some things that are going on that are, so this is where you see some more institutional capacity being developed against the trend in the other direction, okay? I'll point to that. And then the other thing that I think is most important is that not only are people developing those forms sort of in reaction to the attacks on them, but they're rethinking campus organizing entirely. And they're taking lessons from all of this. And what types of organizational forms do we need? What should we be doing? How should we explain this to people? What is this that we're dealing with? So coming out of the end of the Cold War, there's something called the University Conversion Project that changed its name to the Center for Campus Organizing, was around throughout the 1990s, was a very useful center based in Boston, the national board. I was brought on the board in 1999 only to find out that we were $50,000 in debt, so it was, welcome! Thank you. I was all excited about it. And I was like, oh, we have to close it down. Where are their archives going to go? And by the way, the broader left, does not fund campus organizing. I mean, at one point, I don't know if this is still true to the same extent, but we estimated that right-wing foundations and right-wing funding sources outspent sort of left or liberal ones by 80-1 in terms of outside money coming into college campuses to organize. It's probably something similar, right? So the Center for Campus Organizing ran out of money. In 95, I and others started a process we called the Democracy Teach-Ins. Originally, it was called the National Teach-Ins on Corporations, Education, and Democracy. Then we said, that's too much, so let's just call it the Democracy Teach-Ins. The first year, we had a little organizing meeting with 30 people. Dick Flax, by the way, some of you know Richard Flax. There were two old guys who were in the room. He was one of them. That's where I met him. Showed up. He's like, I wonder what these people are doing. In Chicago. Flew out to Chicago. The first year we had 44 campuses. The next round we had 247 campuses, okay, that were doing teach-ins, large scale. I mean, some of them were fairly small, like a couple hundred people. Some places we had 5,000 people, okay, participating in a teach-in on the corporatization of education, corporatization of elections, all this stuff. What is the World Trade Organization, process, et cetera, white supremacy, you name it. Like, I could show you the old packets, the interesting stuff that we would spend many hours shipping out to people, So we had these teach-ins, and the intent was to build the base for something new, right? And we got some of that. Out of that process came something called the 180 Movement for Democracy and Education, which was a syndicalist organization. Basically said, we're going to organize students, campus workers, and community members in one organization. There were only 16 chapters at its height. They were generally public universities in the Midwest and the South, like University of Arkansas, Kansas, Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, etc. But had I would say, a broader influence in terms of framing what it's all about, right? The biggest success for 180 MDE were the student participation in the Seattle protests. So 180 coordinated the student contingent in Seattle. And then the Books Not Bombed global student strike. Okay. Here, these are the Australians, I think it's Melbourne, okay? So in 2003, there were the first global student strike that had happened since the 1970s, right? And it was books, slogan was Books Not Bombs, right? So it's sort of making the connections. Then there was an initiative called the Democratizing Education Network. It was, again, sort of more of this formative process. Let's bring people together. So for that, we had a meeting. Our first meeting, we brought just 25 people from the US up to Ottawa. Okay, because Canadians and the Mexican and the Puerto Rican student and labor movements are like way farther ahead of us than the United States is. So we're like, let's go meet with, the student associations and the unions in Ottawa. And people came back from that and sort of had conferences and meetings, and we're just trying to sort of advance this stuff. There's an effort that started at Kent State University at Rutgers University called Kent State University that then proliferated across the country. Okay, and this was really this prefigured Occupy. Okay, so what this was college students talking about the same issues we're talking about right now in terms of COLA, saying we can't afford to be students. And living in tents. And this is not UC Davis during Occupy. This is UC Santa Cruz. Kent State University got brutalized at UC Santa Cruz during this process. University of Missouri, Kansas City got raided by the police. It was a sort of an important thing, right? There was a new Students for a Democratic Society organization around for a brief period. Okay. So there's always talk. It's usually these young white guys who are like, let's restart SDS. It's always been a talk. They actually did it. It actually was a thing. It mattered for a while. Okay. And the reason why all these things mattered, I think, today, this is UMass Amherst where they occupied their campus, was that people came out of these things, and guess what? Like they went on, a lot of the people who were involved with the Democratizing Education Network went on to become presidents of USSA. Or like my former intern is now the political director at SEIU, when I was at Student Association of Wisconsin. Or there are other positions in the AFL-CIO, or the Wisconsin Uprising, or Occupy. A lot of leadership of Occupy were Gen Xers, right? They'd been around the block. They'd done things before, right? Then directly, and there were demands that came out. For example, the Democratizing Education Network came up with a charter, a 10-point program, which included free public higher education, student debt abolition, right? Democratic control of the university. So that was the first time there was actually a concerted campaign. There were mobilizations and so on for free higher ed and all this stuff, right? Guess what? Some of those people go into Occupy. Jill Stein runs on it in 2012, okay? The Million Student March, this is Santa Barbara. How many people remember the Million Student March? So this was actually the biggest campus for the Million Student March. This is what I'm talking about in terms of the distributed form of organization. This just happened like 4 years ago here, right? The Million Student March, coming out of, this is actually during the 2012 campaign, right? In the aftermath of it, demanding free public higher education and student debt forgiveness, okay? All over the country. This was like a couple thousand students here. And when I look at the COLA campaign today and I look at people at Santa Cruz, I'm like, oh, there's Will. He came out of SDS, and there's Sarah, and I met them back there, and so on. So this is I'm just sort of showing the roots of some of the things that are going on now, but also some of, I think, the weaknesses that we may have, right? Because we don't have standing organization. Like there is no progressive student network today. There is no sort of standing, alliance that exists. I mean, even CGU's gone. Okay, so where do we need to go? I'm going to keep this simpler. What must we do? We need education unionism. We need to focus on system change, okay, so the big picture stuff, and we need to re-engage with the global. Okay, I'll talk about these a little bit here. Okay, in terms of education unionism, there have been fits and starts to this. So basically the idea of education unionism is that instead of organizing as graduate student workers, or as undergrad student workers, or as undergraduates, or as blue collar, or white collar, or clerical, or whatever it is that we are, right? We organize education wall to wall. We organize everybody in the same union, okay? And this was sort of what we came back from Ottawa with, this idea, okay? Like, we need to do this. And people wrote white papers, because there were a bunch of grad students who were there. I wasn't one of them, but they came back, wrote white papers on this, how do we do this? And some of them actually did it, right? So the one that's still around, okay, is the Public Higher Education Network of Massachusetts. Now, it's it's pretty good. I mean, it's pretty good, but it's very establishment. Like, this is a well-funded, staffed coalition of everybody in education, right? It's called public higher education, but now they do K through 12 too, right? In Massachusetts, they mobilize together, they coordinate, they do cross trainings and so on. The folks who came back from UMass Amherst started this, okay, 2005. At Wisconsin, earlier, we had something called the UW Federation of Labor. All the campus unions came together, sent delegates to UW Federation of Labor. They pooled resources, they set up the UW Labor Center. One of the unions was actually the Student Association. The Student Association said, we are a union and we represent students, and students are workers. Whether they're working for pay or whether they're working as students, they're workers, right? UW Federation of Labor. Here's some of the most advanced example of this are the Quebecois in North America, right? So this is, let us say, I don't know how many people know about Maple Spring, but this is pretty badass stuff. I mean, it was like basically a revolution in Quebec. Again, in the last 10 years, right? This is what they do. They do education unionism. So I would say for us, we need to be, wherever we are, whoever we are, we need to be working towards not just having like alliances from time to time coming together, but how do we get into the same organization together? We have differences, we have different interests, we have different perspectives, but we need to be working together because we're all workers in this institution, right? So that's one place we need to go. Second one is, what happens in the university doesn't happen on an island. I mean, university, we have actually, first of all, a lot of structural power here, right? Especially at R1s. R1s are at the center of the new economy, right? And we generate stuff for corporations. We produce, it's a knowledge economy, right? So we have a lot of structural power. We shut it down. That actually has much broader effects, right? But at the same time, what happens outside also affects us. So I think a lot of us understand this, right? And it's one reason why, in Seattle, the students get written out of these histories a lot, right? But there was 20,000 people that we know of formally who were in the student contingent in Seattle, and there were many more young people who were students who were in Seattle, and non-traditional students were there. And there were the people on the front lines getting beaten, But they were also on the front lines for a reason. We were on the front lines for a reason, right? Or on Black Lives Matter, or on the Wisconsin Uprising, which is pretty much a student and teacher uprising initially, right? And by the way, the largest uprising that's happened in the United States ever, okay? The students get written out of these things, okay? But we need to recognize that we have been part of work to affect system change, which means moving beyond capitalism, right? For a reason. And we should be more overt about that in this country. In Chile, they're overt about that, In South Africa, they're overt about that. In India, they're overt about that. We need to be working to build more ties with other people in other sectors, right? Final thing is there has been a turn from the global, right, since the 1990s. I mean, there was something that we call in social movement studies the global turn. There was the anarchist turn. There's a democratic turn. There's a global turn. People talk about the global justice movement and so on. To some extent, even though there are networks, there are ties, people are thinking globally and so on, I would argue that in the last 5 or 6 years, there's been a turn away from the global in terms of organization. And one example of that would be, the World Social Forum process started in 2001, came out of Seattle. Delegates from the global south and the north who were in Seattle, when I say delegates, I mean people who were there for the protests, right, said we need to set this up. That's where the idea for the World Social Forum came from. In Porto Alegre, they initiated it. And there were meetings, of 70,000, 150,000, 250,000 at the largest World Social Forum, Mumbai, in Kenya, in Tunisia, and Porto Alegre a bunch of times. There was a social forum process in the US, 10,000 people in Atlanta, 15,000 in Detroit. That process is no longer moving forward, okay? That process is not in motion anymore. But that's, if we're not doing this, if we're not directly talking to people and working together in student movements and labor movements in other countries, then we're letting capital set the agenda, right? And the corporatization of education is not just happening in the US, right? So these are sort of the 3 fronts that I think we need to move to. And then we're missing part of the, let's say, transformation. Something happened with this slide for some reason. But you can see the important part. So what must we do in terms of affecting transformation? First of all, we got to win this campaign. It's job one. It will make a big difference, not just for us and not just for the next generations of graduate students and workers on this campus and throughout the UC system. It will make a big difference politically, culturally in the United States if we win. Okay? I mean, it's like, I'm guessing most people don't remember the Teamsters strike either in 1997. The first big union strike that had been won. And it totally changed the labor movement in this country, right? People are like, oh, we can win, you know? Same kind of thing here, okay? While we're doing that, we have to organize wall-to-wall on our campuses, okay? So shift from graduate students or graduate student workers to all of us, faculty, undergrads, blue collar, clerical, you know, graduate students, community members and alumni, right? Parents. Find ways to build organization where people can be working together on an ongoing basis. We have to organize and act sectorally to democratize education. So in other words, we need to be specifying like goals that move beyond the COLA. But you know, fighting for, we should have an elected board of regents in California. It's crazy. It's a progressive state. Why don't we? You know, and it can be done. I mean, we have elections, and you know, right now for state assembly, state senate. You know, I went to, not just me, but it's one of the people who did it. You know, went to our state assembly person in Madison in 2000. Said, "Can you author legislation on our behalf to make the board of regents an elected body in Wisconsin?" And he said yes, and we did that, and we worked on it. And it would have made the Board of Regents into an elected body, 1/3 elected by the students, 1/3 by staff, and 1/3 by the public, with publicly financed elections. We want to keep the money out. He authored it, we mobilized for it, we didn't get it, we got another student on the Board of Regents, another appointee, that's what they tried to buy us off with, didn't work, they had to arrested a whole bunch of people and so on, they smashed us basically. But those people are out there still doing organizing and so on. But the point is, he's now co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, Mark Pocan. Okay, so the point is, like, it can be done. You know, there's like we could actually win democratic elections in the University of California system. You know, we can demand popular assemblies on this campus. Right, a lot more we can do. We can make use of shared governance on this campus to an extent that we don't currently. Right, and then finally, unite locally and globally for system change. Link up more directly with the International Student Union, which is still out there. And by the way, lots of student organizations in Africa and South Asia and South America are very involved. They're just waiting for the US to like come to the table, right? So those are some of the things I put out there. So I don't know how much of this, it seemed like some of it was new. I hope it was provocative. I know it's a big ask. Since we're already doing something big, I thought I would put it out there. So thanks for the time.
Thank you so much, Mr. Paul. Something that links up to this point to organize wall-to-wall that I'm thinking of since we were talking about like labor and governance is, where does the like admin bloat and admin sort of, where does someone go? I guess there's like clerical and there's staff, and then there's department level staff who to me aren't like admin, but it's hard for me to like get a sense of like who are our allies and who are the people who are being added to be like the second vice president of the vice provost's office or whatever. Yeah.
For some political reason.
Yeah, or even just for like.
Are you saying who is really needed?
Yeah, I guess so. It's a hard question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and we can throw it open too. I mean, like other folks can chime in on this too.
Yeah.
You know. Yeah. I mean, the only thing I would just say is that, in terms of the bloat question, where did the money come from? I'm of the view, and have been of the view for a long time, that while there is some money to be saved and reallocated, the big problem is actually with the state. You know, and so I think, you know, $500,000 salaries, which are actually, to be honest with you, lower than at peer institutions in other parts of the country. It's kind of crazy, right? Even though the cost of living here is higher. Those are kind of outrageous. I mean, you know, they should not be getting paid $20 times or 30 times more than the lowest paid worker here, right? But we're not going to get a COLA out of eliminating bloat, right? I don't know the answer. I have no
Yeah.
idea, in terms of whose work is valuable in terms of administrators or not.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's that like the UC makes it very complicated to even understand because it's like the size of like 25 state governments
Right.
as their budget. So then I'm like trying to maintain solidarity with like workers and not be pitted against
Right.
like staff members, for example, which is a technique that's been tried in my department. But also recognizing that maybe like at the UCOP level, we don't need some of these positions.
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it seems like that's a task that we should take on. What is the structure of the University of California that works for the people of California? I mean, maybe start from, that's how I would start. Like, what do we actually need rather than, an analysis is also helpful. That helps you to get to where you need. And maybe Christopher Newfield and other people will be helpful with that. Yeah.
Yeah, getting the corporate folks off the Board of Regents would be a good start.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I imagine though, one of the things going up against, or like trying to gain like popular support outside of the university for this kind of campaign is that winning an ideological battle. Because some people, they actually see the corporatization of the university as a good thing. They see it as, right, like these are like the classic, false arguments for free market capitalism and like deregulation and all that stuff, like efficiency, right?
Yeah.
The market forces will make the university run better, right? And like, so yeah, I'm trying to address that. I think we might have to come up with arguments for that, or do you think people, or would you disagree? Do you think people would largely actually, because you said that a lot of people don't support cutting student support for public institutions. Could this be a blind spot then for like many people who in general are capitalists?
Yeah. I think most people are on the sidelines most of the time. During the Wisconsin uprising, one thing the state legislature did was they had massive cuts to the University of Wisconsin system. They also tried to spin the UW. There were some victories during the uprising. They tried to spin the UW-Madison off as a charter university from the rest of the system. Okay, other things, we stopped that. They did freeze tuition. Okay, we actually went a tuition freeze earlier when I was in law school. We had a hunger strike, a week-long hunger strike in the Capitol building. And actually during the Book Stop Bomb student protest, there was another round of that, in Wisconsin and other places. But the point being that even Republicans will campaign on freezing tuition because it is actually popular to freeze tuition, and they have a discourse about elitism that's a little bit different. So it's the professors who are the boogeyman for them, who are getting high salaries. There's no sort of like focus on like, well, where do those professors come from and how much do they sacrifice for how long? It's the same thing with medical doctors, right? But so they're the boogeyman, and so we should freeze tuition because it's we're just funding bloat, right? Basically, right? And so that's so not just in terms of the polling data, but also just anecdotally, or lots of cases. I guess it's not just anecdotal. I can point to a bunch of cases in which right-wingers have campaigned and actually done tuition freezes, right? In terms of the Bioregent campaign, that was enormously popular with the public, and it really got under the skin of the Board of Regents. Oh my gosh! I mean, they were the most disliked group of people in the state of Wisconsin by the time we were done with them. I swear, and it's just, it's kind of, in terms of what you're talking about, efficiency, corruption, etc. People don't like that. Working people don't like that. They want their public institutions to serve them and their kids and to do things in the public interest. And what they don't want is their public institutions being used by rich people to make profits for themselves. So yeah, I think it's a political winner, as we say in elections.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
As we move, so this is like a broad historical question, but I'm a historian, so. So as we move further from the Cold War, right, and this idea that like the worst enemy of all is socialism,
Right.
how much more likely do you think that these movements are to succeed, right? As we see more people our age sort of didn't grow up in the Cold War,
Right.
and don't see socialism as our
As a boogeyman.
right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
does that provide us with more power, or do you think that's just me being naive?
Yeah, I haven't thought about that. I mean, what my initial response was that, so teachers, like they've tried to demonize teachers' unions too.
Right.
But they've largely failed. You know, I know teachers don't feel that oftentimes. My mom was a high school teacher for many years and then a teacher certifier, and most people in my family are teachers, you know, and public school teachers. So it hurts, you know, especially when you're putting in like kind of hours my mom did and other people, you know. But again, the polling data doesn't show that teachers are disrespected. People respect teachers almost as much as nurses, right? And support them when they go on strike. And so the thing about public education in particular is, you know, it predates the Cold War. You know, it came out of the fight of labor in the 19th century, as you know, but for everybody probably know, you know, and for major university systems like this one, land grants, etc., it's a deep part of the culture of the United States. It's part of our sporting culture, it's part of our popular culture. So, like, I'm not going to discount what you're saying, hey, it might be getting better than it was before, but I actually think it wasn't that bad before in terms of people saying, the problems become when, so University of California is actually in pretty good shape in relative terms compared to other public universities in terms of what I think of as the cultural capital of the institution. Because, you know, when I teach and I ask my students, you know, what's your hometown? And I always know it's going to be like 95% kids from California, right? That is not true at other elite public universities in the country, right? So the University of Wisconsin, because there's been that shift in terms of proportion of funding that comes from the state versus students, they're recruiting from the East Coast, just like Michigan was doing earlier, right? And they're recruiting money, right? And so, you know, that's undermining public support for the university system, which many of us say, you know, you start on this track building these luxury apartment buildings for kids from New York, and my parents are from Boston, I'm not gonna be in the end. We call them coasters, okay? There's like a Midwestern anti-coastal thing, you know, that they call us flyover country. Like, we don't like that, you know.
I'm also from Boston. So.
Yeah, I love Boston. It's more a New York thing. Right? I love Boston. I can deal with New York, but the point is, like, you know, it's Wisconsin's a poor state. You know, most of the people are poor, or, you know, working poor. You know, relative terms, right? So yeah, that's a problem, and that's what Christopher Newfield calls the great mistake for administrators, right? The administrators have made this mistake. Well, I don't think they made a mistake. I think they just made a deal, you know. But I get what he's saying. Yeah. So yeah. I think so. All I'm saying is, I actually think that to this day, the public, like, despite all the attacks on the post office, the public still believes in public institutions and public services in this country, and that's American socialism, right? That's pre-Cold War. Yeah. That's my view on it. I mean, I have a whole thing, you know, about, you know, building a democracy movement, and so one of the organizations, an organization I founded in 2004 is called the Liberty Tree Foundation, and we sponsored the Democratizing Education Network, and we set that up. You know, we worked with 10th State and so on, and we sponsored something called the Wisconsin Wave for the Wisconsin Uprising. We sponsored something called Move to Amend to respond to Citizens United, and we were the fiscal sponsor for the tar sands blockades and other things, and the global climate strikes. And we're very small, we're like $50,000 to $250,000 annual budget, depending on the year. Like, we don't have any staff right now; it's just an activist board. But that's what we've done. And the reason why I called it Liberty Tree was sort of out of this kind of a cultural approach that says there's a radical history in the United States, and we should stand on it. And it's got a lot of currency, and we shouldn't abandon things like the Boston Tea Party to people who would have been like on the other side of what was going on in Boston with on the wharves, you know. So anyway, so that's, yeah, there's a cultural fight there, but I think we have a lot to work with, you know.
So these four things here.
Yeah.
Is this also for you? I'm just thinking about your kind of model, you know, organizational, from the institutional to the distributed. So does this require a return to an institutional? So hold on this COLA moment, which gives us a unique opportunity to organize wall-to-wall because it's against the UC, it's against the UC.
Right.
So I can actually organize within my department.
Right.
And across with faculty and other things. So how do we hold on to that, and is it required?
Right. Oh, that's great. Yeah, let's see, where do I want to start on that and not take too much time so we have more conversation. So I'm not arguing for a return to institutional politics. I mean, the United States Student Association going into the 90s, most student activists, most white radical student activists were antagonistic to the United States Student Association. Okay. And the reason was because the USSA had had success in lobbying Washington. And their whole thing was, we will be your voice in Washington. And they were built in a period in which maybe you could actually get some things done that way, right? USSA had also done some good things that it took some of us, including me, a while to figure out, like actually become a multiracial and then student of color-led organization. Like, oh, there's something here, that is important, right? And eventually USSA figured out that they didn't have power in Washington anymore. But the problem was, our critique, which was also correct, was USSA was institutionalized. They were too close to power, and they weren't actually able to mobilize students and exercise and build power, right? So I'm not arguing for that.
Yeah.
I am arguing for organization, right? And so that means organization from below, right? But so one piece, Patrick was here earlier, who was in the social movement theory class I teach sometimes here. So I have students read Enrico Malatesta on anarchism and organization. And it's a great one to assign because it's like, if you want to mess people's ideas about what anarchism is, it's like, we need to have more organization. We need to be better organized and so on. So, that's what I'm talking about, more organization. But not, and I'm not against institutionalization, but it's very important that we understand the distinction. Yeah. Which is, I'm sure you were thinking all that too when you raised it. So.
Yeah, I was just kind of curious on your thoughts. Because the frame is the moving away from institutionalism loss, and it is a loss of some sort.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. But then, having a more dynamic movement is again, look at the Wildcat versus, our union local, right? But I do not want to create unnecessary division right now. And I was talking with a friend of mine who used to be here, who's now at UCSC, about their relationship with UAW, right? And I said, look, I don't want to be creating problems if things are going well, right? But there are other forms of union organization, like United Electrical Workers is a democratic rank and file union, right? So where do we go longer term that is organization, but not institutionalization that immobilizes us? Yeah.
What was that resource? The resource for your students?
It's just an essay by Enrico Malatesta, Anarchism and Organization. Or I think that's what the title is, but Anarchy and Organization. I could send it to you. Yeah. What's that? Yeah, just email me. Or if you Google it, but I can definitely, yeah. I like Malatesta a lot because he messes up a lot of the binaries that we have out there.
You should just put that on the website.
Yeah.
They're probably the name right now, right?
Yeah. He was not a syndicalist, though. But he was not a union guy. But he was, a lot of people get written out. He was an Italian revolutionary who, if you go to Argentina and Brazil and Uruguay, they know all about him. He was down there. He was raising hell. He came to the U.S., was organizing in New Jersey. But he's not part of the pantheon, but he is elsewhere. Yeah.
This might be a bigger question, and anyone in the room is welcome to chime in too, but there was just this article about the COLA movement, about how it's part of the larger housing crisis in California. There's the sort of, one of the UAW position points is that part of the reason why COLA has become necessary even between contracts is there's been such a failure of legislation to repair this housing in California. Am I just being naive or optimistic, or does it seem like the UC being the biggest employer, that we could actually push housing in a positive direction, not just for grad student workers? Because I know one of the worries is that somehow we're going to start a chain reaction of more gentrification, depending on how we get COLA, you know? So it's just sort of like, how do we be mindful of that, and what, yeah, I don't know. What's our position specifically in UC is a larger question. I don't know if we have answers to that.
I mean, that's, to me, that's brilliant. I mean, that's right. You know, like that's, when I was talking earlier about we need to have a, you know, how should the university be governed?
Yeah.
We should have a vision that we're working on of what is the university for? What does the university do in California, right? I talked about the Wisconsin idea earlier, the boundaries of the university are the boundaries of the state. It came out of a much more radical period in U.S. history, back when there were like socialists in Congress from Wisconsin and things like that, but and progressives. But like, yeah, we should develop that. How can this COLA campaign not just help us, but transform the state of California so it works for working people in California? You know.
All right. Just a
And-
modest goal. You know?
No, but I mean, in terms of, there's framing and there's like immediate gains, but there's framing, right?
Yeah.
And how do we enlist, I mean, why in the heck is somebody, like I was talking to someone from the warehouse workers, you know, the other day about their work on the global climate strike, which they're like leading right now. I was like, holy, you're organizing Amazon, you're doing the global climate strike and Earth Day to May Day and so on. But like, why should they, aside from like believing in the movement and out of a sense of solidarity, why should they help us? You know, well, you know, they'll do it, you know, but like we should develop a common program, you know.
Cool.
Yeah, like, it's been, tension, like crops up throughout the history of the university, right? Who is the university for? At certain points in the history, it's been only for privileged people,
Yeah.
and then there have been, you know, uprisings and shifts to open that up to people other than ruling class, elite folks, and then there's another tension between like industry or like art. Is it just job training? Is university just for job skills and you know, professional development, or is it for human development? Is it like for you becoming a more full person, growing as a person? And like, you know, that's not immediately, like there's no immediate financial benefit to
No
that.
ROI.
Yeah.
Return on
So
investment for those who missed that.
Can't quantify it. But that tension, things land one way or the other depending on how things play out in different time periods. Yeah. And well, actually, I wanted to bring in another part of this, which is that one of the ways that I've seen those shifts happen, and it's generalized out to like labor movement in general, but the way that people, oppressed people especially, exercise power, define the levers of power they actually operate. So work stoppages, for instance, withholding labor as a way to shut down an enterprise, or in this case, a university, but still, it's still kind of framed in that way. I'm just thinking as part of our strategy for this wall-to-wall effort, maybe expanding our discussion of that, like what other forms of power do we have? And this could be look different depending on whether we're graduate students or undergraduate or faculty. But for instance, an example from the time period of the Universitas in Collegium, University of Bologna, I think, that they struck by withholding tuition. The students would actually withhold tuition, and then the professors would be like, oh crap, like now we're out of the job. So I don't know, is that something that could happen today? Like tuition, like undergrads, like withholding tuition en masse or quarter? Like what would that even do to like function in the university? I don't know. And then also bringing up things like the strike fund, which is like $80,000 last time I checked for UCSC. Building up like those alternative structures to like weather the storm
Yeah.
Strike ones, things like that. So yeah, I don't know. Like, what does that look like under like the distributed ecosystem that we have now? It's something to think about. I think. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add to that. I'm just kind of sharing.
That's great.
I worry about the momentum of the movement in Santa Cruz precisely because of the reason that on Friday, it seems like that will be the judgment day, see what
Right.
will happen afterwards. And I feel if there isn't any other movements in tandem with what's going on there, strategically speaking, I feel like it's not gonna be enough. And that's why I feel like we're always battling against time. That's what sucks, because all of these movements happen. And I find myself just personally just coming into it and being like, oh wow, this is all going on, and you're trying to figure out what's been happening and trying to do something at the same time. It's like it's constantly you're just at this you're running up a hill and your shoes are so heavy that you can barely get out, and it sucks. And I'm just like, what are we gonna do in order to help Santa Cruz, because it seems like we're just not ready yet. You know, that organization that we need. It sucks. It's like I don't want to be like a defeatist, but like where can we start implementing all these 4 steps like immediately, because that's what we need.
Well, I was just say, I think maybe you can. I mean, we're actually have more grad students committed to action than Santa Cruz had when they began their action. Like, so I think there is organization, and it does feel like growing uphill. I jump on matters most and I get off right away because I get overwhelmed. Like, I mean, I think there is organization happening.
It's happening very quickly, but it's happening.
Very quickly, but it's happening. Yeah. But I mean, UC Santa Barbara is ready to strike. It's capable of striking, and I mean striking out, not just strike.
Yeah.
But in a capacity that's greater than Santa Cruz was when they first initiated the action. So that's exciting.
Yeah, I mean, what I was writing to people about this, because I've been, like I got 3 kids and just like everybody else, lots of other things, and doing everything I can, to, as you're saying, like in this moment. But so I've been reaching out to people. I like 10 minutes of my time reaching out to somebody who has influence is one of the things I can do, right? So I was saying, look, this is like, Madison on February 13th of 2011, before the uprising started, and 3 days later, there were 50,000 people out. That's what it feels like to me. It feels like Monday in Seattle, in November 29th of 1999. That's what it feels like here at Santa Barbara to me. Now, yeah, there's a couple hundred people who are involved in doing work right now, but that's a lot of capacity. And then when people have to decide what side they're on, and there's firings, at Santa Cruz, whatever, it will expand, But only because people in this room and other people took leadership.
Yeah, I read there was an interview that the UCSC organizers did, and they were emphasizing the fact that while they're the leader, like they have like an organizing committee that like acts as leadership for COLA organizing, but the actual like base of it is through like the popular, the larger graduate student body, and like it's the fact that they were ready to strike that made it happen when it did, because they realized that they took the temperature and they said like, oh okay, like people are actually ready to strike. We just have to, people did work to lead it, but like everyone else, like once they said okay, we're doing this, all these people came out of the woodwork and like let's do it now.
Well, also, like, as people see, like, oh, other people are on board, that gives them, like, the confidence to join in as well. So I think it's, like, kind of a snowball effect, right? Because if people are like, oh, like, several hundred people are in on this, sure, I'll do it now. I just don't want to be the only one out there on the picket line. But once you're like, oh, okay, this is a big thing, I'll jump on, I think it only gets stronger and stronger.
Yeah, exactly.
This is a question that I've asked and nobody's had really an answer except we're irreplaceable, but I just want to make sure I'm not being too optimistic, which is like, so yeah, if all of us stop working, like how would they possibly replace our labor? I mean, are there like scabs you could bring in from like another school? You could have, I guess, someone who's like really precarious adjunct or something like that.
You would never get hired
Yeah.
You know, like, I mean, in some fields maybe, but I don't know all the fields that well, but I mean, all the fields I'm familiar with, if it got out that you were the one who came into UC Santa Barbara, like, you're not going to get a job someplace else, you know? And our faculty, for the most part, are not going to.
No, they're not willing to do our work.
They're not going to do the well, and they don't really. But even if they're willing, they're not going to do it anyway because they don't want us to get crushed. I mean, there are committees there, you know.
Yeah. It's
Also, they want to work with us.
Yeah,
Like,
right.
we help them.
Right.
And they help us.
yeah.
They don't want to be in a department with no grad students. That'd be terrible for them.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Just checking.
I mean, I'm not. I don't want to make it seem like there's not.
There is risk.
There's
of course,
risk, yeah.
but and especially for like international students.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. And but I mean, but to me, it's just like. It is in some ways just a game. It's like a bluff.
Yeah.
It's just calling a bluff. I mean, it's just, and I don't, you know, Napolitano. I mean, I don't have any sense of her personally. You know, I don't know if anybody here's ever met her. No, that tells you something. You know, she's been here for a while, right? I mean, that tells you something. But I mean, she seems kind of hostile to not to us, but I mean just to the institution. You know, so yeah.
Solidarity, we shall move forward.
Solidarity forever.
Yeah, Friday is really gonna be. We're gonna find out. Yeah, how badly that they're voting.
Yeah.
But
Or how stupid they are.
Or how- yeah.
I mean, honestly, I guess that's what I was trying to say. It's like, how stupid are they? You know.
Yeah.
It looked bureaucratic, it's so overwhelmed, like, as it is, like, what are they gonna expect? Like, their point's so important, I don't see how they're gonna do that.
Yeah.
Grad students are one thing, but undergrads don't know about this, and I'm an undergrad, so I just feel like we still have this distance between us and the grad students, we don't see that, so once
Right.
they're not there, we're like, oh wow, this is really messed up. Everything's just collapsing. No one's teaching us anymore.
Right.
But they're just out there talking about themselves. Who's actually teaching us?
I feel like in so many departments too, it's really like the grad students who are like leading the education. Like I can name so many classes I've taken where it's like I would not have survived if it wasn't for grad students. Like professors
Yeah.
could have done that.
That's like everything I've learned about pedagogy. I've learned some things from professors, but mostly from fellow graduate students as I've been like working up, because there's still this assumption or understanding in some people that like the only thing you would ever want to do is research, and also that jobs are available where you can only do research, and therefore you should only be focusing on your research. So even if that were true, even if you wanted that R1 thing, you still would have to be a good enough teacher to get hired. Like, it's just like, it's this whole dissonance thing. Anyway, that's sort of a separate conversation.
But I mean, for me, in terms of undergrads, you know, one thing that really strikes me about teaching sociology, you know, just how exhausted so many of my students are, you know, and so we should be talking about that.